Hello and welcome back to class. In today's video, we will be demonstrating and lecturing on the topic of assignment 2, color. For this video, I'm going to be demonstrating essentially how to start the color assignment. I will be talking about how to complete a one-to-one grid so you can apply the grid transfer method to this assignment. I'll also be reviewing some basic tips and tricks for working with colored pencils. So to begin, we will need a couple of things. First off, we are going to start with our lovely image set for this assignment. This was given to you on your project packs at the beginning of year. So hopefully this should look a little familiar. These images can also be found on your project sheet, just listed at the bottom. As you noticed, we have 5 major works here, all ranging from a variety of different contemporary and historical artists. So we have quite a plethora of things from you to choose from. We have things, or images rather, that are quite complex, and other images that have a lot of mark variety or color value variety, things that break down into kind of simple shapes and forms, and other images that are really complex in terms of color theory and skill level. So there's a variety of different choices here for you to choose from. All of these artists are masters in their own rights in terms of mastering color theory and image production, but they also add something really unique to the historical art canon of color theory itself. So I hope you enjoy these works. Pick one that you like to do or you're interested in, and you'll be off to a good start with the project. So I'm going to go ahead and start with one of my favorite images in here, and that is this Carrie James Marshall painting, Untitled Painter. So I'm going to go ahead and begin here. Now, as you notice, all of the images on the project sheets do range in size or in scale, meaning that they don't quite reach that 8.5 by 11 size, and that's completely fine. What we're going to be doing is essentially measuring this out and making a perfect 1-to-1 ratio grid measurement, and then transferring and drawing that information over using that 1-to-1 grid ratio scale. So I'm going to demonstrate that first. So first off, to be clear, your images will all range just depending upon the image that you select. So you won't have a perfect 8 by 11 image that you're turning in, but rather you're going to scale and size it to fit your original image or working sheet that you're working from, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and grab some of my drawing paper. For this assignment, we're going to go up here in materials and just kind of find what I am recommending. So under step 1, we have a kind of listing of project materials and guidelines. So you will be working around a 8.5-11 by page. Remember, this is not going to be exactly 8.5 by 11 because your image or reference image is not 8.5 by 11, right? It's some unknown size, 7 by, I don't know, 7 something, right? This is pretty squared. We will be using some drawing paper for this assignment, so feel free to make sure that you have your drawing paper with you, and possibly even some sketching paper on the side, so you can practice with colored pencils, especially if you have not worked with them before. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of map out in the center of my page essentially the dimension of my original image. I'm going to make sure that this is exactly the size of this image, top to bottom and left to right. And I'm going to kind of center it in the center of my image. So that way, if I want to kind of have some room to kind of play or experiment with my colored pencils, I will be able to do that. What I'm going to do now is just kind of go in from the border of my page. I'm just going to go in 1 inch so I can have kind of this outlined border for me. And I'm going to use my whole page here. This is about 11 by 14. And a lot of this, you're going to see what I'm going to do here. This is just a crafting tip that, I might recommend, just so I can have some extra paper for me to draw on and make my kind of measurements on. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of lightly draw a very light line over on the right side with a graphite pencil. This is a mechanical pencil too. I'm just going to make a really light line. I don't know if you can technically see it because of my exposure right now, but just a really light line right here. In fact, let's go ahead and lower our exposure a little bit just in case you need to see something a little bit clearer. Okay, that might look a little bit better for you guys. There we go. All right, so that way we can see that kind of line right there, and we can have a better kind of transition. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to measure from the left to the right, and I'm going to get what the dimension is of that particular side. And then I'm going to draw my ruler out, okay? So let's see. Let's measure it here. I'm going to put my ruler right up to the very edge. And I want to make sure too my ruler isn't crooked when I am trying to take this measurement, because that's going to be an incorrect measurement. So make sure that your ruler is pretty parallel with that image. All right, so this is pretty even. I'm just going to push it over just a hair. And this is about 7. Okay, I'm going to just mark that on my ruler. Alright, I'm going to do the same thing here. It's probably a little lower though, so I'm going to just do that. Alright. Then from here out, I'm just going to make sure that measurement's even, and I'm just going to grab a measurement on the side. Okay, perfect. That's even too. Great. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and now just very lightly run my pencil along those marks, making a nice long line. So you can see I have got 2 lines running down parallel. As you can see, I'm just slightly centering this image. It's a little off center. The reason I'm doing that is because I want some extra paper for me to draw on the sides. So when I'm done with this, I'm going to cut my image out, making sure that my image doesn't have any white excess. So essentially, when the colored pencil or the image stops and my colored pencil stops over on my image here, essentially that's where I'm going to cut it out, right? I just want a nice clean precision, but I want some extra playroom right here just in case. So what I'm going to do now is measure top to bottom, and I'm just orienting the page so I can see it a little bit better. Okay. Got a little bit of a weird measurement here. And I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to measure an inch up from the top. This way, this will give me a nice even measurement, so I'm not starting at some random point over on the left side of my page. Let's go 2 inches up. I'm going to do the same thing over here, do 2 inches on this side. Going to make sure my line is nice and parallel once again with this kind of light graphite line that I put down. Alright, and then from there I'm going to go ahead and make my measurement. So I'm going to put it right at that tick, and then I'm going to make sure my ruler is nice and even. Then I'm going to go where that line was. Same thing over here. Hopefully this is nice and in frame for you. Alright. And then I'm just going to close this line in. So I am creating a 1-to-1 image. So essentially this is the exact same size as my Carrie James Marshall reference photo. And that is absolutely critical for this project. So make sure you star that, write that down on your hand, forehead, I don't care. It has to be an absolute 1-to-1 ratio for this project to work accurately. All right, so as you can see, I've got a nice square kind of 1-to-1 ratio. This is the exact size as my Carrie James Marshall reference image. As again, I'm going to stress this and I'm going to repeat this point. It has to be the exact same size because we're making a 1-to-1 grid ratio, so we can transfer this content over by using that grid transfer technique. All right, so I've got my image. It's oriented in the right viewing orientation, meaning that my image is a little bit taller on top to bottom. Top to bottom here, it's a little bit taller, so that's good. I've got extra space around my image. This is going to be really helpful in particular when I want to start working with my colored pencil and I need to make sample kind of colors or experiment with blending. There's a variety of different ways that this can really help us out in terms of just making a better image. So make sure if you do this, you'll have plenty of good drawing space around you, but make sure when you do this at the very end that you cut it to this line and you make sure that there's no extra white space hanging off on that beautiful drawing that you made for me, right? We want to make sure that we have nice clean images, and when we go to mount it, it is just the image that we're mounting and not some extra white crap on the side. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start my grid transfer. And I'm going to start with my image first. So what I'm going to do is every inch, starting from the top here, I'm going to mark it with a little tiny tick of my pencil. I'm going to use my ruler to do this, and then on the other side, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to make sure, since I'm starting on the top over here, that I'm going to start on the top over here. So that way, each inch goes down in a consecutive and even order, and they're going to stay equal to each other. That becomes really important, especially when you're working with a different scaled or sized image. Since this one is like an odd kind of measurement, I want to make sure that when I do have my 7 inches going all the way down, that they're going to match on both sides. And when I get to this bottom, since this isn't going to be a full inch here, this is technically where our 8-inch mark is, that this check is going to be equal with this side, okay? So what I'm doing now is I'm just going to start, like I said, at the top of my image, and I'm going to go down 1 inch on both sides, right? All right, same thing over here. I'm going to flip it so it's a little bit easier for me to view. Once again, I'm going to make sure my ruler is hitting right at that 1 inch mark. And then I'm starting over here instead of down at the bottom. So this way, when we get down to that weird little one, this weird little not full inch, that measurement's going to stay consistent throughout. Heck, I'll even do the little 8 down here just to stay consistent, right? So you guys can see what I'm talking about. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect those lines. So I'm just going to take my ruler and put it straight up there. It is starting to turn a little daytime into nighttime right now, so I'm going to go ahead and adjust my brightness once again. We'll try auto this time. We'll see if that works. This might be scary. Ooh. We'll try it out. Okay, there we go. All right, so what I'm going to do, like I said, is I'm just going to line up my ruler with that line, and I'm just going to draw a line straight through. So I'm going to create a grid over my image here. And then I'm essentially going to transfer this grid onto my drawing sheet where I just measured out those borders just a few moments ago. So this is a little bit of a patience thing here you gotta have. You gotta make sure you're precise, you're really following those marks and lines, making sure that your ruler is matching up to those points on every single line. I know it can be a bit tedious, but it is an extremely helpful tip to do, especially when we're doing this project where it needs to be precise. All right, so I've got my lines of my grid. Hopefully you can see them. You can see kind of the graphite maybe in some of the blacker areas kind of reflected, but you can definitely see them in some of those lighter zones. Okay, so this is a 1 by 1 grid and 1 by 1 inch. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a 1 by 1 inch check on the top side, going from left to right. So once again, I'm going to start over here. I'm going to keep it nice and consistent, top left. So I'm going to start with all of my images. And every single inch, I'm going to put a little dash with my pencil. Now, sometimes it really helps if you draw a little bit heavier on your reference image. And when you go to draw your reference image on your paper, to draw light. So that is a big critical tip here. So once again, I'm flipping this now. I flipped my image, so I have to flip my ruler. Once again, right, we're gonna start with our 1 inch over on our right side, or our left side rather. So I'm gonna go ahead, every inch, same old thing. I'm gonna make a nice mark so I can see it. And then now I'm gonna connect those dots. So I will have a perfect 1 by 1 inch check, and my grid will be complete. Now I'm drawing pretty heavy, as I suggested on my reference image. It doesn't matter if you draw heavy on your reference image. In fact, it will help you to see what you'll be translating and drawing if you draw heavier during this stage or on this particular image. It, however, will hurt you quite a bit to draw heavy on your actual image. So that's where I always caution students, when you go to make that grid on the drawing paper that you'll be making into your own drawing, make sure you draw light. I'll repeat that again too once we get over there, just to make sure. And you could already see kind of the difference in my hand quality, right? I might even want to go back over, since I drew a little bit lighter, from my left to right side of the grid. So you can really see those checks now. I'm going to go ahead and just darken this up just a hair, because I don't think I made it as dark as I should have, because I'm having a hard time, especially seeing, because he's got a lot of really nice chromatic blacks over here that are operating in a really beautiful way, but they're very kind of hard to distinguish, especially in low light, which is kind of what I'm working in right now. I'm working on replacing bulbs. So once again, the big thing here is you just want to make sure that grid is a nice 1-to-1 scale grid. You can do larger grids if you want. For this size paper, I usually always recommend just doing a 1 inch by 1 inch grid. You can make it smaller. I've had some students do like a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch grid. So that means instead of marking it every 1 inch, you do it a 1/2 inch. That can work too. It just depends on the student, and it just depends on what you want. Alright, so as you can see, now I've got a really nice grid. You can see it reflected really nicely with that graphite, especially in those black areas, which is going to be very helpful. And we can see how the grid is really nice and even and perfect on both sides. You'll notice that my funky checks are going to be on the bottom. When I say funky checks, I mean they're just not fully an inch, and on my right side here. So I'm going to go ahead and make a note of that I need to pay attention to my right side and my bottom side, because those aren't quite full inches, right? So that's something to really pay attention to, and so when you go to transfer it over on your larger drawing sheet here, that you stay attentive to that space, okay? So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start a grid going from my left to my right coordinate all the way down, and I'm going to repeat the same process on this image. Alright, so once again, every inch I'm going to mark a little tick with my pencil. Now I'm going to be really light here. When I say really light, I mean really light. You should barely see your grid when you draw it on this image. This image you will be drawing with colored pencil. And remember, colored pencil is a very different medium than our graphite. And colored pencil will actually resist graphite. So if you start drawing a really heavy grid, you'll be able to see it under our graphite, and that will be very problematic for this drawing. So you want to make sure that the grid that you're drawing on your actual drawing paper is very light. All right, so I'm going to double check this. Remember, my little out of even or uneven or not full inch is going to appear over here. So I'm double checking this to make sure that's correct. Yep, that's right. My right side is my short side, and that looks right to me. So I'm going to go ahead and start filling in my lines. Always double check your work and make sure that your lines are lining up with the image lines on your resource image. You don't want to have to redraw this grid, especially halfway through. You will hate your life and you will curse me and everyone you know. This is a time-intensive project, and to make sure it turns out well, you really do need to make sure you're spending time to develop your marks, your lines, your color shading, and the accuracy of the forms. So making a nice, even, accurate grid is the first part of that step. So I'm going in here and I'm being very selective right now, very delicate with my lines. I'm barely putting any pressure, and pushing very lightly with my pencil. I'm kind of just more like lightly dragging it across the page. So it's going to be a very faint line and extremely easy for me to erase. All right, and remember my right side was the short side, so this is correct. Success. All right, we have an even grid. All right, 1 inch. Going top to bottom. Now we need to create an even 1 inch and close these boxes off, going left to right. All right, so I'm going to rotate this down, and remember once again, this was my short side, so I need to make sure that my ruler is oriented to hit 0 at both of these sides. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and do that. Make sure this is all lined up. Once again, my angle is correct and it's parallel to my border, and it's not all at an off skewed or weird angle. It's pretty important. All right, remember my bottom right. That's my short side, so that's correct so far. I'm going to do the same thing now. I'm going to orient this in a different way because it is a little hard to see. Now I oriented it to this way, so that means I'm going to have to change my ruler. So if you're doing that too, just make sure you're keeping an eye on that ruler. I know I sound like a broken record, but trust me, this is like the #1 area that everyone screws up. And since I won't be there to personally check them and correct it, that means you're going to have to double check your math a lot. All right, so I'm going to double check, right? My short end, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and just line those up. It even helps too, like what I just did on my reference image, where I put my right side and my bottom side. I made a note that was my short end, right? So I recommend maybe doing that too, just to keep you on track and make sure that you're paying attention to that space and you know which side to keep as your long and short end. Now this is probably going to be pretty true for all of the images because they're probably all not going to be a perfect measurement, meaning they're not all going to be perfectly 1 inch all the way down and all the way up, right? Okay. Now I'm just going to go through, like I said, I'm being really particular here and fuss budgety. And I'm just dragging my pencil really lightly across. You can see how light this grid is compared to my other one. I'm not carving in my pencil. I'm being very light and delicate. I'm dragging my pencil just very lightly. So this will be very easy to erase and I won't have to worry about it. You're going to see how important this becomes, especially when you get into your lighter values or lighter colors. How much of a difference this actually makes, because that colored pencil, especially on those light values, they'll just show all of the graphite lines and it can look really bad. All right, I'm going to double check my grid before I start drawing. Once again, shorter side on the right, shorter side on the right, shorter side on the bottom, shorter side on the bottom. All right, so I've got my beautiful grid here. You can see it, it's very faint, but you can see the grid here. We do want it faint, remember, on the image that we'll be drawing on, and on the surface of our resource image, we want it darker, okay? Just so we can make sure that we see all those little individual checks. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to start the drawing process. So we've got a 1-to-1 inch grid that is mirrored both on our resource image and now on our drawing paper. The great thing about this is that we can actually just literally transfer our image. Sometimes it helps some students to fold this over. So I'm going to go ahead and do that just so I can see this grid. I'm just going to get rid of the white. You can cut this off too if you want. I just want to be able to see the color of the image without any distractions. This is actually kind of a very good tip, especially when you need to go view the color for accuracy. And I will give you a couple of examples too. So now it's time to bring out our colored pencils. So colored pencils really can range quite a bit. And what we will be working with is a pretty decent colored pencil, especially for the price. And it's called Prismacolors. As you can see, I just kind of flattened out my image. I still have the kind of paper in the back, but I've got my full image here that's been folded over so I don't see any of that white space. Once again, it's a perfect ratio. As you can see, it fits perfectly in that square. And so that way I can start drawing and have everything right in the side of the image. So my first grid that I'm going to transfer is essentially this little section here. So I'm going to do in my little tiny short corner. Now, as we go through, essentially the beauty of this technique is you are going to draw almost like paint by numbers in a way. You're going to be just drawing check by check and filling in the information in each little square as you go to the grid. So essentially you're going to be outlining all of the major composition components, the lines, the eyes, the line as it's going down on her shirt, her collar, her brush, her hand, our palette here, and this outlined painting in the background as it appears in our resource image. So it's going to be a very easy kind of one-to-one relation. So I always just start in a corner. Usually I start in the top right, just because I'm right-handed or right-handed, excuse me. So I start on the top left. So there's not much going on in my top left corner. So I'm going to go down to maybe at my fourth corner down here. So usually I like to label these two. So A, B, C, D, F, G, H. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now if you want, this is where maybe your paper comes back in handy, where you want to have it unfolded. Because maybe you want to do the same thing here. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that way each check has a kind of coordinate that you can go to. So I'm going to go actually and start my drawing maybe in A4, since I've got a little tiny thing that pops up there. And then you're going to just systematically go down each check. The reason I like to start in the top left-hand corner because I'm right-handed is so I don't smear any, all right? Now, here's some things that you can do too with this. So you can start this off with a colored pencil. You can do a light gray colored pencil, or you could stick with graphite. If you are going to use graphite, draw extremely light. As I mentioned, graphite and colored pencil do not mix well. If you draw really heavy with this, it will be very hard to erase, and your light values, especially in areas like this, you'll be not only able to see the grid, but you'll be able to see that line underneath, and it'll look horrible. All right, so we want to have good craft on this, so draw very light. Okay, even with the colored pencil, you're still going to want to draw light. So the beautiful thing about the grid is that essentially we're going to, this is going to be able to break it down so you're able to see this information really easy. So if I'm looking at this and I'm going to start my drawing over here, I can see if I were to divide this space in half, that's actually where the back of her chair starts. So I'm going to just look at where the half point is on my image here, and I'm going to say, okay, maybe it comes up here, right? Because that's probably the halfway point. And then I'm going to look at how far it comes over. So essentially I'm just going to extend through my grid this way. And it only has maybe like 1/8 of an inch, right? So I'm just going to transfer that measurement over, and it just goes down a little bit and then over. Now I'm going to go into A5, and it just kind of has just a little bit of an angle on it, okay? Now, as I mentioned, if you're having a hard time drawing really lightly, what I would recommend is maybe switching over to a colored pencil that's light gray and draw really lightly with a gray colored pencil, because you do not want your graphite being able to be seen. In this process. Alright, and let's say that's maybe not, her shoulder comes in from our B5 into our AB, or A5, excuse me, and a little bit above halfway. Maybe we could say that's a quarter. Maybe about right there, maybe a little bit lower. And then we can come in and say this is where it comes in. It exits our A5 square, probably about here. So we're just going to go ahead and mark that point and make a nice kind of clean line. There's a couple little ridges, so I'm just going to be a little bit sensitive to that with how I'm drawing it. It's not a perfectly smooth line, so I'm going to be capturing that information. And then I'm going to go ahead and finish drawing this form out. Alright, I'm going to look at my positive and negative spaces. I think that looks pretty accurate. I'm going to go ahead and start finishing off the other details in this image. That's probably about right. A little bit more of a point here, so I'm going to go back and kind of fix that. I'm going to take my eraser and just kind of carve out that little space. Now this will be a long process, as I mentioned, because you're drawing really accurately. And some of this can get really kind of confusing kind of fast, especially when we go into areas where there's a lot of detail, all right? So be really attentive in these kind of spaces, all right? And then essentially you're just going to go down and kind of keep on rendering the drawing. So this is a really nice project because in a lot of ways, you know, you can do this while you listen to other things in the background. If you want, you can listen to some of your other color podcasts that I have posted for readings this month or this week and during this unit. So you can do other things and multitask. This is almost kind of a meditative process where you can really work and listen to other things. Just kind of have some fun, zone out for a little while. And just have a fun time drawing and coloring. You're essentially making your own color book right now, right? A more badass color book because you're like drawing from, like, you know, Kerry James Marshall. He's just pretty badass. So alright, and that's about it. So I just gave you 2 examples of those checks. Of course, you're going to finish this and complete this process as you would. But as you can see, you can really quickly develop kind of key points in your drawing and really be able to get a really accurate and extremely well, yeah, just an extremely accurate drawing. So, and that's what we want out of this process. Also, this is going to help teach you how to sight measure a little bit quicker because you're going to be able to really see what you're looking at. because we're breaking down these checks into these kind of 1 inch by 1 inch checks, and it makes it really easy for you to see what you're drawing. So that drawing process becomes really sped up. See how light I'm drawing? It's very easy to erase without having any kind of leftover residue. But getting back to my point, you know, this really breaks down being able to see drawing and get you to draw very accurately, very quickly. So that's kind of our point here, is giving you another kind of lesson on 2D arts where you can start thinking about how to draw, especially if you're not very comfortable drawing. This is a good method for learning how to see from observation and training your brain to see in those kind of spaces. And then you can just kind of go at it, all right? All right, so that's what you're going to do, and you're going to kind of work your way through that process, going from column to column or row to row, completing and filling in each check as you go along. Make sure you're paying attention to those lines, any kind of shading detail, shadows that are happening, folds that are happening in the fabric, or outlines, even little numbers here, and these kind of shadows that are happening within the colored painting area that she's filling in on herself. Make sure you're paying attention to those and you fill those in, because that'll be really important for later drawing. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about some colored pencil tips. So there's a variety of different colored pencils out there. There is a oil-based colored pencil and a wax colored-based pencils. There's also a variety of just different kind of qualities that you can have. We're not going to go into all of the tips and tricks and working with colored pencils, but there are a variety of different things you can do. You can, you know, use a razor blade with them. You can use a solvent to mix colors or blend colors. But there's a variety of different things we can use here. So just to start us off with, I'm going to pull out some colored pencils. As you can see, I've got plenty of room on my page here, and this is going to be really helpful for me, especially when I go to start drawing information on the side and painting or drawing in here. I can go and practice these kind of coloring skills, these kind of color overlays, and I could really get the exact color on a situation. So I'm working with Prismacolor colored pencils. That's what I recommend for this class. You can get a variety of different sets. I've got a 48 set that I'm working with. I've either recommended, I think, a 24 or a 32. I think that's what I recommended for this class. I think maybe I put just 32, but you can go all the way up and scale up if you really like color pencils to 150 set. So I kind of go back and forth and work with a lot of color pencils in my own kind of practice. So it's a good medium to learn, and it's a really good medium to learn color theory because of the way you layer. So we're going to be playing with color theory and investigating color theory throughout this unit, and keep on exploring it past this unit, because color is just a huge thing and you can never keep on practicing it enough. So we're going to go ahead and dive into it and get started, and we're going to do that with colored pencils. So the great thing about this project is that we will be using layering. The nice thing is we have a resource image that we will be able to use and kind of turn to. Don't be afraid to fold your image over so you can look at the exact sketch and figure out if the color's right by just optically looking at it. That's going to really be helpful, especially when we go into really evaluating whether something's working or not. We can do that too already here. I've already got my kind of starting of my sketch here, so I can kind of look and see if that fold really looks well. This also, folding this paper could be a good crafting tip when you're working on check by check. If you're getting confused with all of the lines and if this seems like a really overwhelming project, just break it down and start to fold your paper in section by section as you move up to double check your work and to make sure it's working and looking like the way it should. So to maybe find some complicated colors, all of them are going to be complicated in their own way. Always use a test sheet, but you're going to essentially start with a base color. So I've identified the base color of my shirt here, and I'm just going to do a little swatch of colors so you guys can kind of get the idea of this. This is going to take a lot of practice, and that's why I recommend having a lot of sample sheets around you so you can get the kind of color information down and test it out before you go to your image and draw. Color pencils really work best when layering. So you have to layer usually quite a bit, especially to get accurate color. So I started off with a base, and I just kind of guessed, just going through here, looking at what a base color for this, her shoulder might be. And I just kind of looked at it and said, okay, I think it's this one, so I'm going to start here. Now as you're working, you're going to notice that this color maybe needs to be a little bit darker. So then you're going to go back in and just add a little bit of brown, and we're going to get it right up to scratch. Not all colors need to be, you don't need to always darken a color by adding black. A lot of times you can add browns, blues, dark greens, even violets sometimes, to really create a nice color shift and a color value. So right now I'm just working with the pencil up and down to create a little bit more even value. I'm going to start working left to right. This will give me kind of a hash mark or crosshatch. And this will just start help blending that kind of material together. Now as you're noticing, I'm going back and forth and really developing this. And I'm going to go ahead and start, I think, getting us where we need to go value-wise. This is pretty accurate right now. I'm going to go ahead and just do one overpass. And I'm going to start burnishing. So when you burnish something, that's kind of the end of your kind of cycle or working with a color. Essentially, you work really heavily with a pencil, and you build up that space with darker marks. And that's really going to help kind of bring out that color. And this particular color, I'm actually seeing a little bit of purple, so I'm going to see if I have a purple or maybe a brown that looks a little purplish. I don't think I have a dark purple. Oh wait, maybe here I do, yeah. So I'm just going to add just a teensy bit of it. Adding a complement, you'll often find, helps neutralize a color. So this could be a good technique, especially when you're working with a grayer tone of a color. You're going to also be able to learn what chromatic grays do and what they look like and help to identify them. A lot of this is just going to be practice. You playing around with the material, you figuring out what kind of color you need to add to make this a successful image. I think it just needs to be a shade darker now. So I'm going to go back in with a darker brown. This is a different type of brown. And I'm still seeing a little bit more purple, so I'm going to go back in. And neutralize it a little bit, because yellow is purple's complement, or vice versa. So to make our yellow a little bit more neutral, I'm going to add purple. And as you can see, I was very quickly able to develop an accurate color. I'm going to go back over and just lighten it up just a little bit more with burnishing it with a lighter yellow. And I've got an accurate color that is match to match perfect. All right. So we can do that too with more complicated colors like our whites. Our whites are actually going to be probably our most challenging colors to capture in the image. Not only because you have to draw lighter, but because they have a lot of different colors in them. White is one of the most challenging colors to get as an artist, and you're going to figure out how complicated they can be. Even just pushing too hard, you can really ruin a color. So we need to be really, really light with our colored pencils, especially when we're dealing with any kind of white surface area. Just being really attentive to your hand. I don't even think I have white in my, oh wait, here I do, yes I do. So I'm doing a variety of different lighter tones here to capture this kind of off-white color. You can really see that it's off-white just based off of its relative closeness to our white border here on the page. And this is also something really fascinating about color theory. Things look relatively white or relatively cooler or warmer just based on what other colors sitting next to each other. So color is always going to be a little tricky because of that. It is never quite what it seems. You always have to pay a lot of attention to it. Going back over with white just to push down the value a little bit more. I'm burnishing now, so that means that I'm like really pushing down heavily with my colored pencil. And I think I need just a teensy bit more blue in this and purple. So I'm going to go back over and just drop the coolness of this color. that there's not just purple and blue in this, there's also a peach tone, right? And there's also kind of an orange. So I went in and added a really nice kind of taupe color. Topaz has an orange base. And I also added a kind of peach tone to this. I'm going to burnish, so I'm cross-hatching back and forth, and I'm pushing pretty heavy now with the color pencil. As you can see, I was able to match that color pretty perfectly. So it just takes some sensitivity, it takes some work to develop, and it really takes patience. So make sure that you're looking at your colors, you're folding your sheets over, and you're really doing that trick that I taught you where you're really thinking about how to see the color, and you're looking at the color directly as you're working with it. That's going to be the biggest way that you learn how to see it. The second tip that I have for working with color and like learning how to see it properly is thinking about adjusting a color on its coolness and its warmness. You can always see coolness or warmness just by putting that image right up to your color swatch that you're working with your colored pencils. It'll be very clear when you start to add, let's say, a dark purple versus a really bright orange, right? There's going to be some warmness differences and some coolness differences when you start to layer those colored pencils up. So once again, like I said, having some excess paper on the outside of your image is really going to help you kind of figure out some of those harder colors. That way too, once you have those checks of color made, then it's kind of like a color sample card. You can go in and say, what did I need for that color? And I needed all of these colored pencils to create this one color. Versus this image, or this color, I needed all of these colored pencils, right? So I needed a total of 6 colored pencils just to make that one color, and my white, I needed 5. All right, so pay attention to those color complexities and really start to break down what you're seeing in the image. Each of our images here are really going to range in terms of what colors, values, and hues and chromas you're really going to be identifying. Also notice when you get to value areas that you're not just maybe putting black in, but you're putting browns and blues and dark greens. So really pay attention to particular areas of the color that's shifting in a colder or warmer sense. And once again, that's when I bring you back to this tip. Fold your paper over so you can identify, check to check, how that color's looking. And then when you can start to bring it over and say, yes, that's right, no, that's wrong, then you can start to break down your image and your color a lot more effectively because it is right next to what you're developing, okay? So there's also some other areas. As I said, start off with that base color when you're working with colored pencils. Identify what the base color is of something and then bring that out. Start drawing that as a ground, similar to how I started these off, and filling in that area kind of almost like a paint by numbers. And then go back over it with a couple of other layers of other types of colors to layer in that saturation. Because essentially when you're thinking about colored pencils, if we can explode that out, you're going to have maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 layers in between that color. And all of that light is going to pass through those layers, bringing out different tones and dimensions out of all of those colors. Such as our white here, right? Our relative white. We had 5 different colors in them, and they had 5 different types of layers that had to be stacked up in between. So it's really going to vary color to color, so you have to be sensitive. Make sure, like I said, you're following this tip, folding your paper over when you get to a certain section. Make sure that you're looking at that color and identifying whether that color needs to be shifted to a warmer category, to a cooler category, if the value needs to be increased, meaning it needs to be lighter, or if the value needs to be darkened. And what kind of dark does it need to be? Does it need to be a blue? Does it need to be a purple, a brown, a dark green, something along those lines? My next little kind of thing here is just make sure when you are sweeping your colored pencils away, they do kind of break off in some areas, that you're not sweeping too hard. It might even be a really good idea to have a brush next to you so you can actually sweep it away. Sometimes you can actually drag the pigment out, and that can be a little bit devastating to your drawing because then you'll skid it across everything. The way colored pencils kind of work as well is that, especially Prismacolors, since they have a wax base kind of substrate, that's the binding agent that holds our pigment together. They do dull down quite a bit when you're working with them, so if you do have some really detailed areas, like in particular this work does, where I have these really nice intricate lines up here, you'll have to have, and I'll bring it up maybe here so you can see it a little bit more. You'll have to have some areas, here I'll kind of zoom in there too. In this particular area where you have a lot of those lines built up, you'll have to kind of go back and make sure that you're sharpening that pencil. This can also be a little bit of a pain, especially too if you'll have to mix this color. So just be delicate in some of those detail areas, and make sure you have a pencil sharpener nearby, because Prismacolors, although they do have great saturation and make wonderful color, they will become dull quite quickly just because of that soft nature of the wax. Don't be afraid to blend. Don't be afraid to, take away what you need to take away and make risks where you need to. My last little thing here is talking about erasing colored pencils. I'm going to just do a quick little erase of this. This is where it becomes really important that you have your test sheets on the side. This is with a decent eraser. Colored pencils do not yield to erasing very well. This is not like graphite. They are harder to erase. They do take multiple times to erase. It's obviously going to be easier to erase a lighter value than it is a darker value, but that doesn't mean that you're going to totally erase that material. It'll just kind of stain the paper, and because of the wax-like nature, you're actually heating the wax up because of the friction caused by the rubber going over the paper. So it can actually heat the wax and carry it over to different parts of the paper. So that's why you want to be careful when you start this project, that you really use that test sheet on the side, and you make sure this form is drawn out well before you go in to color it. Also too, if you start drawing heavier marks with your colored pencil, especially on lighter areas, it's going to be absolutely horrific in terms of quality. So this is me pushing pretty heavy with the colored pencil. As you can see, I've got two different values here. It's not showing up very well, or it's showing up very well with the yellow and not so well with this dark purple, but you can still see it under there. So that's why you want to make sure you're drawing really light with your graphite pencils, because otherwise when you don't erase this, or when you have a really dark mark, it's going to be very obvious. It is a good idea too to, as you work, especially when you get into your whiter zones, like up here, this is my white zone, I'm going to go ahead and start erasing those lines before I start to draw into the actual image. Make sure to always erase any grid lines before you start coloring with your colored pencil, because otherwise you'll be able to see your grid lines transferred through on that colored pencil, as you can see over here. So that's going to conclude this basic demo for this video. I will probably be talking about this once again in class, and maybe even working with you guys individually. Please make sure to feel free and rewatch this video to refresh your mind, and to even stop and maybe when you go to actually work on this project, have this playing in the background, so these useful tips and tricks and material know-how can really start to transfer and be a nice cohesive kind of message going through. All right, you have an excellent day. I hope this helped, and good luck and happy drawing.